carpet upon my entry, and I see that's not here. And I suppose there's no honorarium at the end of this talk. We searched through all of the albums at home and at the cottage. We could find no decent pictures of our family. So what we have found was a penal colony on the island of Madagascar, which will suffice. Now, what I want you all to do is to take a deep breath and hold it till the end of my talk. At times, I'm going to have to sit down because I have a little arthritis and stenosis in my back. I'm hoping to grow out of it, however. And so let's get down to the serious part. My two grandfathers were both born in Germany in 1872. That was Emil Deister and Max Ermscher. And it just so happens at the age of 6 in 1878, they both came to America. And Max Ermscher to Fort Wayne and Emil Deister to Gar Creek near Woodburn, Indiana, which is very close to the Ohio line. My grandfather started working as a student in grade school and farming at the same time. And after 8th grade, he decided he had received all the intelligence that he was ever going to get. So he went to John Bass, who had owned the Bass Foundry in Fort Wayne, a huge foundry and engineering firm, and said he wanted to work in the drafting and engineering department. And John Bass said, "No way, son, you're going to start out as a stable boy," which he did, and eventually worked himself up to be manager of all of the staff in the whole estate. At the age of 21, he began work as a lathe operator in the machine shop there and became interested in ore separation, separating the mineral from the all of the impurities. And so he had worked now up to being a draftsman and engineer, and John Bass had sent him out to Minnesota and the taconite mines and up to Houghton, Michigan, and the copper mines to develop something to try to separate the pure mineral. And at Houghton, he developed a piece of equipment, and it didn't work. So he hired a barge, put it on the barge, took it out to Lake Superior and sank it. He finally successfully invented a jig that worked, rented a barn, hired the band, and had the entire town of Houghton invited for a party. Then I have to use this, otherwise I'm going to go off on who knows what. In the meantime, he had married a nice little German girl, Caroline Ohlschlager. You can tell we have just a hint of German blood in the Deister family. And he began experimenting in his basement with making a piece of equipment that would do like a panning for gold. Pan like this. Unfortunately, I didn't bring one. Pan for gold, which you shake back and forth, and by means of specific gravity and so forth, the gold would come off at a certain. So in his basement, he built an ore concentrating table, dismantled it, took it out to Arizona, talked to the people at Kennecott Copper, Phelps Dodge, and the people out there at the copper mines, and he sold a bunch of those tables. So came back to Fort Wayne, and in 1906, he formed the Deister Concentrator Company. He and his brother Bill and a bunch of stockholders, and started building concentrating tables. In March of 1902, my father, Erwin Deister Sr., was born, and a year and a half later, his brother, Emil Jr., was born, 2 boys. He, knowing my grandfather, had a little stubborn streak in him. And of course, he had a falling out with the stockholders and said, to heck with it. He sold the company and sold his United States patents to a Deister Concentrator Company. And in 1912, he formed the Deister Machine Company in direct competition with Deister Concentrator Company, which had no Deisters in it. So it ended up in court. Case was finally solved in 1920 at the appellate court. My grandfather won the right to use his own name, and that case is still being used. Matter of fact, there were a couple of families in Fort Wayne with chop-offs and so forth that had restaurants that used that case to open competition. In the meantime, in 1908, I forgot this actually, in 1908, he had traveled to the Klondike in Alaska to set up concentrating tables and to work with the gold that was there. He was there for a while and decided he was lonesome. Wired my grandmother to come with the two boys, get on a train and boat and come up to Alaska. This was 1908. The boys are 6 and 5. She put them on a train, went to San Francisco, got on a boat, went up to Juneau, and for 6 months, they were in Juneau, Alaska. That set my father, my uncle, back a year in going to school. As a matter of fact, the 2 times we've been to Alaska, and the last time we were there was in 2006 for our 50th wedding anniversary. There are still parts of the old mill up on the hill in Juneau, Alaska. In 1919, my father had finished his sophomore year at Fort Wayne High School, which became Central High School. And he had been working with the ukulele and playing the banjo and became quite proficient. So in 1919, he came up to Wawasee one day and applied for a job with the Ross Franklin Band at Waco. Ross Franklin had come down from Chicago and his orchestra played at Waco. My father got the job playing first banjo and sleeping in the car. And my grandmother said to my grandfather, Emil, no more sleeping in the car. They came up to Wawasee and bought a cottage on Ideal Beach from the Lambert family. This was 1919. He paid $6,000 for that. Unfortunately, he didn't buy the 5 empty lots to the west. I probably wouldn't be sitting here today if he had done that. I'd be sitting on some throne somewhere. And he told Mrs. Lambert, I don't want you to take anything out of this cottage. You could take your clothes and so forth, hand mirrors, ashtrays, whatever it was. You leave it here. Bought the cottage. 4 bedrooms, basin in each bedroom, big 1,000-gallon water tank in the garage for the lake water because the lake water was pumped into those basins in the bedroom. And in the one corner was a huge assembling tank where they had made the gas for the gas lights.
Keep going, keep going.
Gas lights. Unfortunately, when my grandfather bought it, they did have electricity. Both my father and my uncle became good sailors. They were taught, and I can't remember the captain's name. I think he lived in the house that Dr. and Mrs. Cast owned, and he taught them to sail. And they had a sailboat, and they named it the Rowdy. And they liked to race, and they would oftentimes race Bill Dalton. Bill Dalton had the Warsaw, the Dalton Foundries. His cottage was west of Ideal Beach. And they beat Bill Dalton every time. So Bill Dalton said, well, the heck with that. So he took a bunch of his heavy iron castings, put them in the bilge of his boat to make it more stable. And the next race, he capsized and the boat went straight to the bottom. Dick Tuttle, Sr., was our next door neighbor, and he and Roy Brown, who lived down the way, bought the cornfield behind them in 1922. They formed the South Shore Golf Course. My grandfather was member number 1, my father number 2, and my uncle number 3. And they loved golf, and they played a lot of golf. My father entered the University of Michigan in 1921, graduated in 1925. His brother, Emil Jr., entered in 1922, graduated from engineering in 1926. In August of 1925, my father married Martha Ermshire. He had dated her all through high school. She also had a cottage on Morrison Island, and they were married. And a year or two later, his brother, Emil Jr., chased Sophia Ermshire to Europe, asked her to marry him, and they were married in St. Paul's Cathedral in London. In June of 1929, I was born. Those were the golden days, the roaring 20s. Shortly after that, the Depression hit. My parents blamed most of it on me, and so they decided to try again, and my sister Elise was born in May of 1933. Emil Jr. and Sophia then had been married, and they had 2 children, Sonia born in 1934 and Mark Deister in 1938. In either 1933 or 34, they had outgrown the Rowdy as a sailboat. So the 2 brothers enlisted Bill Knoll, and they bought a used A scow. Bill Knoll, the Knoll cottage was number 7 with the big boathouse out in the water. The A boat was 38 feet long. It was the only one on the lake at that time. They never formally named it, but they called it Zumbo. And they sailed that. And they sailed that quite a bit because the wives had gotten tired of them being golf widows. That boat was old, and it would tend to flop a little in the middle, so they cut 4 feet off the stern. Oftentimes I would sail with them, and I remember on one time we landed at Knoll's cottage, and that cottage was very well furnished, and Laura Knoll, Bill's mother, a real matriarch, she really didn't like kids walking around that cottage. Well, I had gotten off the sailboat, and Bill Hall's Scotty bit me in the leg, and I was bleeding quite profusely. So they carried me up the steps and into the house, and Mrs. Knoll really almost threw me out. But I was okay after that, and no tetanus. In 1934 and 35, because of the Depression, and my grandfather was paying his employees really out of his own pocket, we rented the cottage, and we all stayed down at the Ermshire Cottage, which today is the Horde Cottage, second one in from the point on Morrison Island. And along with the 7 Ermshire kids and the Deisters, fortunately, they had a sleeping porch. And at one time I counted 16 beds on that long sleeping porch. It was a German term would be Gesellschaft. They also had, and it's still there, the old wooden boathouse with the big wooden doors, and there was a winch at either end. Half the boathouse was Ermshire and half was Hattersley. And that winch, to lift that wooden door, you had to be very, very careful. And you can't imagine the number of broken arms during the summers when that winch They didn't lock it, and it would get loose. It would come around so fast and hit you on the arm. We as kids were never permitted to do that. When, in 1935, I was 6 years old, and I was taught to swim by my cousin, Fred Fleetmeyer, another Ermshire. If I could swim between Ermshires and Hattersleys, he would take me to the Strand Theater in Ligonier. I persevered and made it to the Strand Theater. Max Ermshire, by the way, Max Ermshire Sr., my grandfather, died of pneumonia in 1935 at a very young age. But in those days, you got pneumonia, that was called the undertaker. During this time, when we moved back to the cottage, Ideal Beach as a resort area was in full swing with the big slide and the sleds going down the slide, diving platform, ice cream, candy, swimming area. And every time a sled would get ready to go down that slide, a buzzer would sound. On the weekends, beep, beep, beep. You didn't want to try to sleep during the day on the weekends. Also, at those days, there were the charter speedboats for rides. Oh, the Flash, Miss Miami, Crown, Blue Streak. Blue Streak was basically out of Sergeant's Hotel and was claimed to be the fastest boat on the lake. And next to Sergeant's Hotel was the Bishop's Marina. That's where we kept the sailboat. Well, in 1941, he can't hear me anyway. 1941, we pulled the A-boat out of the storage and back, and every spring you had to caulk it, the old wooden house. You caulked it, and then you put it in the water, and you let the water soak it up. You bailed it out, put it back in the water, and generally it was fine. Well, we had several of the cousins working and caulking, putting it in the water, sank. This was Saturday. Bailed it out, re-caulked, sank. Decided, okay, we'll leave it there overnight. Next morning, bailed it out, put it back in the water, it sank, bailed it out, back in the shed. That was the end of Zumbo. During the war, I think it was 1944, we had an offer from the South Bend Sea Scouts, and we sold it to them for $35. And I don't know what they ever did with it. Also, and during the war, a good friend of ours was Bill Rockhill, and he had an E-boat. He was in the service, and he had the Deisters. We had the use of that E-boat during World War II. Also during those years, and I don't know whether any of you here remember it, but 1943 was probably the epitome of a low water level at all the sea. Usually around our seawall, I suppose the water is 15 to 18 inches deep. We had 16 feet of beach. I think that was the year that finally Eli Lilly thought about it, and in ensuing years, he had that beautiful Swedish 22-meter boat, and with that fixed keel, he couldn't sail. And I think that's why in 1950, he enlisted my father, my Uncle Art, Jack Vanderford, and that committee, and they got the dam built. In those days, in the 30s and early 40s, Solt's Grocery, which was across from the old South Shore Inn, was our source for groceries. You could go into Syracuse at Grieger's and Black something or other and buy stuff, but Solt's was mainly it. That's what my grandfather, by the way, they called my grandfather the governor. Never referred to him as dad, it was governor. he would walk down to Soult's, and Johnny Shire, who had married Lucille Soult, was running the grocery, and he would pawn the stuff on my grandfather, and my grandfather come home, walked home, sacks of grapes and oranges and all of that stuff, and he'd walk in the back door and he'd say, Lena, Caroline, look what I got. And she'd say, oh, Emma, what are we going to do with all of this? Well, anyway, another thing about my grandfather loved his beer. And at night, on the weekend, especially Saturday night, he and Lena would sit in the kitchen, close the doors, and get out the Limburger cheese and beer and run a fan so that it didn't go through the house. He also loved pig's feet and pig's knuckles. In those days, we went out to eat at Pap Clayton's. That was the old Syracuse Pharmacy restaurant, Pap Clayton's, which was right across the alley from the hardware store in downtown Syracuse. And then Mellinger's. Mellinger's served Sunday meals in their home, and that was right across the street from Tom Yoder's house, Mellinger's. And then in later years, we had Louis. Next to the grocery, they built a restaurant. And it was my grandfather's favorite trick that every Sunday noon, off with the bathing suits, on with decent clothes, go down to the sweat box and sit there for hours having a Sunday meal. That was a sacrifice, especially for us kids, because when you did come back home, you had to wait 1 hour before you could go swimming. They did cramps. In the early 1940s, or mid 1940s, we had watched, being on our pier, we had watched a speedboat come towards us from the east and then make a circle at where the creek, South Shore Creek empties into the lake. They would make that turn and go back. We found out that was the jitterbug. And the people water skiing behind it were the McCumber kids. And we didn't know how to ski. Well, we knew a nice gal by the name of Marilyn Weller, who had a cottage, similar to where the new cottage, their cottage was torn down. That's where the 2 new cottages are being built. And she knew the McCumbers, and we asked her to introduce us to the McCumber kids. Our parents had known Bill and Mary Ann Cumber years ago. And she took us down, we got introduced and started seeing each other and learned to ski. And that's how we met parts of the Adams family. And at that age, I had started being interested in Janet McCumber. Beautiful gal. And we started dating. And I spent considerable time down at the Adams cottage. That was Roy and Leona Oni, 2 grand people. And Roy was a tinkerer. He had, as you'll learn later, had formed the Adams Motor Grader Company. And he was a tinkerer. And they had a large, I think it was an old Garwood or Hackercraft. They called it Tinker Toy. And what Roy liked to do, and he had done it with Jitterbug, is take out the old engine and he put a Ford engine in the Jitterbug. And he was putting a Lincoln engine to replace the old Kermit that was in the Tinker Toy. And he had a mechanic, Matt, okay. And he virtually spent all summer up here working on that. Either the water pump wouldn't work or the generator wouldn't work or exhaust had a problem. And so I spent a lot of time down on that pier just enamored with what was going on. And Janet and I went to some movies together and had a good time, Also at that time, one of the McCumber's good friends was Marjorie Teeter. And the Teeters, that was Perfect Circle Piston Rings out of Hagerstown, Indiana. They had at that time 3 cottages up here. That was Uncle Dan, which is now the nunnery. And where Russell Anderson built his, that was Don Teeter's. And then Ralph Teeter was the one up this way towards Waco Point. And by the way, I had met Ralph and Mrs. Teeter and spent considerable time with them. And one day, Ralph came to me and said, Irv, I want to show you something that I've invented. And he came out with a special brass doorknob with a special lock on it, beautifully machined and a special lock and all this and all that. And he explained the whole thing to me. And then we got to talking, and he would always talk about what a wonderful drive he had up here, and the flowers and the trees and all of this. I didn't know for 2.5 months that he was blind. That's what a wonderful man he was. He had been blind since the age of 8. So his daughter Marjorie, we had a great time together. By the way, I think she just passed away a 1.5 years or so ago. The Teeter family, I became good friends with Tom Teeter, Tom and Mary Ann. They moved to Fort Wayne, worked for Magnavox. They just celebrated their 70th wedding anniversary down in Pawleys Island, South Carolina. So we had good friends, good friends. Our cottage was dark brown when it was purchased, and with an open front porch. Half was screened in, half open. 1925, my grandfather had all enclosed with windows. Sometime, I think in the late 30s, my parents decided, and I'll claim an insult, decided we got to lighten it up. They liked the silver gray of the Adams cottage. We painted our cottage silver gray. You can see we all get a little tied in here together. In 1943, they became tired of the silver gray and wanted the cottage painted white. I was given the contract. That's rough cedar siding on the first floor, cedar shakes on the second floor, 3-foot eaves, tongue and grooved, second floor, 2-foot eaves. I had to move all the stuff all by myself. Needless to say, I didn't finish the job. Somebody else had to finish it, but that was my summer. I had received as a birthday present in 1948 a Lyman boat with a nice motor on it, and called it my speedboat. I had just finished my freshman year at the University of Michigan. You'll note that the good Deisters all went to the University of Michigan. My father, my uncle, and my cousin Mark, myself. Some of the others I'll refer to later. In the fall of 1948, Michigan played Army at Yankee Stadium. Janet had enrolled at Smith. I had invited her down. We spent the weekend in New York. She at the Barbizon, I was at a fraternity house. And then subsequently that New Year's, she had invited me down for a dance in Indianapolis. And that was my last date with Janet McCumber. She had, in the meantime, found some hunk, I think a returned vet at Amherst, and whom she subsequently married. That was the end of that romance. Mine, that is. In the early 1950s, we had renovated the kitchen and the upstairs bathroom. In 1951, after 4 great years, I graduated from the University of Michigan. I started out in English major. And then I went to work for Deister Machine Company at the same time, going to Indiana Extension in Fort Wayne at that time, working on a master's in business. I was drafted into the Army in July of 1952. Ended up at the Army Finance School in Indianapolis and subsequently was made an instructor at the Army Finance School, Fort Harrison, Indianapolis for my remaining 18 months. That was my Korean battle, tri-state area. And I think 1948, my dad and his brother purchased a used e-scow, which we completely rebuilt. Refinished all of the mahogany, new hull, new canvas, took all the brass fittings off, took them down our basement, put them in a lathe and buffed them up shiny, took them to Franke Plating Works, which is across from our factory, had everything chromed, all new stays and cables. That boat, D23, 23 Skidoo. That was our sailboat. In 1955, I also was introduced to 2 great people through a mutual friend of ours, Bob and Nancy Myers. Those of you who were ever privileged to know those 2 people, fine people. He worked for Alka-Seltzer and then retired here, had the cottage next to the old South Shore, the old Deitzken cottage. They had previously lived in Dr. Myers' cottage, which was next to the old Harrison cottage, which became the Pops cottage, and which today is Huffman, the monstrous white cottage. That's Kathy Pop Huffman. I know this doesn't mean a whole lot to you, but
Marrying Uncle Bill.
oh, yeah. My sister had always had her eye on Bill McCumber. And that was a hard nut to crack. Bill was very definite, very reserved, didn't talk a whole lot, 6'3", very handsome individual. Well, they finally started dating, and miracle of all miracles, September of 1958, they were married. So there are the Deisters and McCumbers and Adams. We finally have a formal tie-in. And they subsequently had 2 children, Martha, born in '60, and Bradford, born in 1962. Mark Deister, my cousin, 9 years older, younger than I am, graduated from the University of Michigan and eventually came to work for the company in 1963. He had a daughter Deborah and a son Richard by his first marriage, and by his second marriage, he had 3 daughters, Jessica, Sonia, and Kara. Emil Deister Sr. died in 1961, at the age of 89, and Caroline, his wife, died at the age of 93 in 65. So at that time, the cottage became owned by my father and my uncle, which we shared, and we sort of split up by month, alternating months of who would be with who. We had gone through the era of over 20 years when it was a Gesellschaft. 16 to 17 people sleeping in the cottage. Who knows where we all slept. My mother and my aunts were absolute queens, real matriarchs to put up all the feeding that crew. Dirty bathing suits, towels, all that. That's part of the lake. No air conditioning, electric fans, out in the sun all day, for which we have now all suffered. Nobody ever heard of SP 15 or 30 or 50. Emmel Jr. died in 1984, and his wife Soph a few years later. And so Mark became half owner of the cottage. In the fall of 1987, Elise and I bought Mark out. He had inherited the old Grayson cottage, which was next to Tom Yoder's. And so he had that cottage, and Elise and I ended up with the cottage, and that's the way it is today. Elise is in an assisted place in outside of Chicago, and we share expenses, but I basically manage it. No, that's not.
Say it's gone through some renovations.
Hmm?
Say it's gone through some renovations. And
Oh, yeah. Thank God. During the years, it's gone through several renovations, especially in 2001. We added some bedrooms and some major things. My mother passed away at the age of 100 in January of 2003. And I want to go back just a little bit. My father died in 1988, prostate cancer. He might still be alive today for them. And so Mark and I became, in 1988, Mark and I became the owners of Deister Machine Company. At that time, we made ourselves chairman of the board and he president as co-chief executive officers. Most people said, you're out of your mind. It won't work. It's worked beautifully for 32 years. We made an agreement. If we had a disagreement or an argument, we would settle it that day or sleep on it and settle it the next morning. Haven't had to do it yet. I take care of the everyday finances and administration and sales. He takes care of the workforce and engineering and research and so forth. It's worked beautifully. We're more than just first cousins since fathers married sisters, but fortunately, we aren't brothers. His son, Rich, came into the business and is now our executive vice president. And the fifth generation Deister, Max, his son came into the business 2 years ago. Max graduated from Purdue. It has held us back. But we have managed to survive. It's mainly because Mark and I are still very active in the business. When we depart, we're hoping. By the way, up here is a model of one of our vibrating screens, which separates gravel, stone, crushed stone, gravel into different sizes. That's our main product today. That model there, in actuality, weighs 45,000, 2.5 tons. And is approximately 10 feet tall and 10 feet wide and 26 feet long. This is our 108th year. We also have up here, this is not a sales talk, by the way. We also have up here little booklets that we did in 2012 on our 100th anniversary. Gives the history of some of the members of the family, the company, and all that. I think you might be interested. You may read it if you'd like. A week from now, we will have a telephone quiz, and I hope that you all pass. I have two daughters, Mindy and Ellie. Mindy is married, had a son and a daughter Mackie, son Frederick Flick, who's up in Harbor Springs. Ellie, my daughter, they live in Harbor Springs, Michigan. My daughter Ellie is married and lives in Bay Village, Ohio, and has the 5th generation, Thomas and Katie. So we're still, and Marty is sitting here, is married, has 2 daughters, and I'm not going to go into that because I'm sure that will be covered under the other part. And a son, Billy. That's all I'm going to say. I hope she refers to you, even though you live out of town. Okay. In the past few years, we've done an awful lot of renovating of the cottage, but we have still maintained the idea of a cottage. I think it's called the prairie style, a lot of woodwork, so forth. In 2016, the so-called June, the so-called tornado or wind shear hit our 3 cottages there with a real blow, and basically the neighbor's trees going into our yard, and we ended up with about $60,000 worth of damage, but it's all been restored. That just sort of hop skipped down the shoreline, and we were one of the unfortunate ones. An interesting thing in going through this the other day, I found an old tax return, and I found one for 1971. Property taxes were $498 for that property. This year, $13,200. I want to give you just a little background of the Ermshire family. Our Ermshire subsequently got the Ermshire cottage on Morrison Island after the death of my grandmother. His son Al eventually bought Parker Whiting's cottage, tore it down, and built a new cottage. That was done, and then subsequently he died. That's number 460. Steve Ermshire, his son, built the cottage next to him. And then Dr. Bud Ermshire, who just passed away, bought the cottage 2 doors from Dillon Creek. And his son David now owns a condo in, I'll call it Buttermilk Point. That's about all I have. I could go, having lived 91 years, and the Lord has blessed me and blessed my family. I had married, well, I said yes. I was married to Jane Mackay. Half the family pronounce it McKay, half Mackay. The real Scots call it Mackay. I married her in August of 1956. We had celebrated our 62 years together, and she passed away in September 2018. Fortunately, I'm doing great. This is still here. People say, are you ever going to retire? Deisters don't retire. We go out the door feet first. As long as this works. As long as I'm an asset. Instead of, I'll remain active in the business. I appreciate you all coming here on a nice Saturday afternoon. Thank you again. I hope I